Making myself look dead, or it was nothing to do with death itself. It was making myself look as different from me as it was possible to imagine, so that I could really be convincing as being somebody else.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen seemed to be an ordinary man with an ordinary life.
Bloody finger with great pillar.
But behind the facade, he was the stuff of nightmares.
I think it killed somebody.
Because Nilsen was a killer, with the blood of at least 12 young men on his hands.
Dennis Nilsen wanted to be in control and dominant and domineering.
A seemingly boring civil servant who hid in the shadows.
Nilsen was known as dodgy. He had a terrible temper. He was violent. Control freak.
Now, the story of the making of a mass murderer can be revealed in never-before-aired material.
My whole life has been lived on this profile of being the odd one out.
Exclusive testimony from the detectives who brought him to justice.
There's a pair of legs sticking out the end of a big black bin liner.
I said to him, "How many bodies are we talking about here?" And his reply, "I've killed 15 or 16.
It was one hell of a shock.
How many people were buried in that garden?
The prison interview the Home Office tried to ban.
It was my power and his passivity. The more passive he could be, the more powerful I was.
And the families of Nilsen's victims speaking for the first time.
My dad was relentless in the way he said to Martin.
He said, "Where are you, son?"
Dennis Nilsen destroyed my family.
Sorry.
You hold the body out one of the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it out.
This shocking interview was filmed in 1992. A cold-blooded killer calmly describing how he got rid of his victims.
Come the summer, it got hot, and I knew it'd be a smell problem. But I thought, well, I'm going to have to deal with the smell problem. And I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion it was the innards.
This footage hasn't been seen on British television for over 20 years.
On a weekend, I would sort of pull out the floorboards, and I found it totally unpleasant, and I'd get blinding drunk, so I could face it, and start the dissection on the kitchen floor. So I'd go out and be sick outside in the gardens.
But how did we get here? 12 years earlier, Dennis Nilsen was in the middle of a murder spree. Opportunities for a serial killer seemed horrifyingly easy. Britain was undergoing huge social change, but not everywhere.
I joined the Metropolitan Police in April 1979. I came into the station and there were two guys there who were on my team. I went up to them and said, "Hi, I'm WPC 814, I'm starting today." And they looked at me and said, "Oh, for fuck's sake, we've already got one on the team, we don't need another one." That was my first introduction to being a female police officer.
In the early 80s, London was a magnet for thousands of young people heading to the city to follow their dreams.
It's a familiar story. Every night, trains from Scotland and the north carry those hoping to escape a dull and dreary existence and looking for the extra excitement they believe life in the capital will bring.
But for many, the reality was very different, and huge numbers were going missing.
At any one time, 8,000 people are listed as missing in London alone. A clear illustration of how easy it is for someone to simply disappear without trace.
We would give it 24 hours. If they didn't come back, then we would obviously do the surrounding police stations, have they been arrested for anything, hospital checks, but that's really all we did.
In 1983, I was the detective inspector at Hornsey Police Station in North London. In those days, the Missing Persons Bureau was a small office at Scotland Yard. They didn't have a national database. It just wasn't very professional at all.
They've often deliberately cut all links with the past, and this makes them an easy target for exploitation by criminals or conmen.
Because they were young, they were inexperienced, and when they got there, you could say they were led astray.
It meant they could be easy prey for someone like Dennis Nilsen. Martin Duffy was one of them.
Oh, Martin had a lovely smile. Yeah. He'd do anything for anyone. He had a heart of gold.
Hazel and Graham are talking for the first time about their brother and the last Christmas they spent together in 1979.
You look at those photographs and you can see he was happy.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's one of the best times, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, as a family, we were all happy and we were all together.
Yeah.
In May 1980, the 16-year-old ran away to London in the hope of finding work, something he'd done before. But this time, no one heard from Martin after he had arrived.
He didn't go to any of the contacts we knew he had there. He just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Martin's disappearance was reported to the police. His name was simply added to the list of thousands who were missing in London.
My dad was relentless in the way he searched for our Martin.
And there was a photograph of Martin by his bed, and he just looked at it and he said, "Where are you, son?"
It was obvious that something bad had happened.
And something terrible had taken place. 3 years later, the truth was about to be revealed. Hornsey Police Station, North London. Detective Inspector Steve McCusker was about to get a report that would haunt him for the rest of his career.
A uniformed colleague of mine came to my office. He told me he'd been called to an incident at a house in Cranley Gardens.
Plumbers had found something suspicious down a drain they were unblocking. McCusker headed to the house with his boss, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J.
When we got up there, we saw a number of people standing around an open manhole cover.
What did you find?
A mass of flesh. Very heavily suspected that it wasn't animal.
One of the people in the house was quite interested.
That's correct. Yes, the guy, I believe, was living in the top floor flat. Yeah.
The man living in the flat was a job centre supervisor called Dennis Andrew Nilsen.
It was snowing, sleet, real miserable, wet, dark evening. As boss told him, "Look, put the manhole cover back on and we'll come to investigate it in the morning, in the light of day."
With the manhole left unguarded, the neighbours heard Nilsen going up and down the drain at around midnight. When Catherine returned the next day, the remains had gone.
If a manhole can be sparkling, it was sparkling.
But he did put his hand up and he was able to extract from the smaller drains in the manhole what looked like the fingers and knuckles and skin and bone of a human hand. We got a phone call from the mortuary telling us that indeed the bones were actually from a human being. The main suspect was a guy called Dennis Nilsen. Sometimes he goes by the name of Des.
Des was due home from work at around 5:30. Detectives Peter J., Steve McCusker and Jeff Butler were waiting for him.
He arrived and he was dressed in a trench coat, wearing glasses, carrying a briefcase. We did say we were police officers from Hornsey Police Station. Nilsen expressed some surprise at this. He said, "Since when did police officers get interested in looking at people's drains?" We said, "Let's go up to your flat and we'll tell you all about it." He opened his door with a key. It was a grubby flat. There was a grubbiness to it, and of course the smell was absolutely awful. It was the smell of death. Peter said to him, "Stop messing us about, where's the body?" He looked shocked. It suddenly dawned on him that the game was up. And he simply said, "It's in there." He pointed to a wardrobe to my left. So I opened the wardrobe and I saw 2 black bin liner sacks full to the brim with the remains of human bodies. Peter J. then told Nilsen he was arresting him on suspicion of murder and cautioned him.
The detectives put Nilsen in the back of their car to take him to the police station. What he told Steve McCusker next would be a defining moment in the case.
And so I said to him, "How many bodies are we talking about here? 1 or 2? And his reply, which shocked us, "I've killed 15 or 16. There are 3 back here, and the rest I've killed in a flat I used to live in."
Scotland Yard launched its biggest murder investigation today after a pathologist confirmed that human remains found in a sewer outlet were parts of 3 bodies.
We knew we had not just a killer, but he said he was willing to tell us all about it. We thought, well, we're going to have a murder investigation, or we just get on with it.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was under arrest on suspicion of murder. Detective Chief Superintendent Jeff Chambers and DCI Peter J. would question Nilsen, while DI Steve McCusker ran the day-to-day investigation.
It was in this quiet residential street in the North London suburb of Muswell Hill that the extraordinary series of events began to unfold.
The eyes of the world were now on Nilsen's flat as the murder investigation intensified.
When we arrived at the property, we went upstairs to the 2nd floor flat. Walked into the flat, and straight away on the left-hand side there was an open kitchen. I noticed there was a head in a cooking pot.
They'd been boiled. I think there's still a bit of hair on the scalp, but half the flesh was hanging off it and peeled back. That'd been severed right across the back of the neck.
This is the first time these officers have talked publicly about the horrors that confronted them.
It was one hell of a shock. Probably the biggest shock that I'd ever received at a crime scene.
At Hornsey Police Station, Nilsen was talking to detectives calmly and lucidly, telling them what he had done.
He was answering all the questions. He wasn't nervous. The only thing that seemed to concern him a lot was that he told me he had a dog.
Ooh, bloody finger, you great pillock.
I thought to myself at the time, well, he's concerned about the dog and the remains of 3 bodies lying in his flat of men he'd killed.
During his interviews, Nilsen gave detectives details of some of the men he'd murdered over a 4-year period. But he could only remember 2 of the 3 men he'd killed in Cranley Gardens, his final victim, who was called Sinclair, and a man called John from High Wycombe. He was also telling investigators where they should look for more remains.
In the bathroom, there was an upturned drawer, which had been used as a shelf. We turned that over.
We almost held each other's hands as we did it.
Underneath there was a pair of legs sticking out the end of a big black bin liner.
Bin bags containing body parts were removed from the wardrobe. So was a wooden box holding limbs and a torso. Investigators also found 4 carrier bags filled with internal organs.
It was unbelievable what we were seeing. This was the work of a man clearly deranged and not in his right mind.
The detective's main challenge was to find out who he'd killed. Using fingerprints found in the flat, The first person to have their identity confirmed was Stephen Sinclair. The 20-year-old from Perth had been strangled in his sleep. Stephen Sinclair's identification within 48 hours was crucial. It meant that Nilsen could now be formally charged with murder.
Nilsen had been brought here to Highgate Magistrates Court from Hornsey Police Station early this morning. Dennis Andrew Nilsen looked straight at the magistrate as the charges read to him. That he did, on or about the 1st of February 1983, murder Stephen Neil Sinclair.
A picture of who Dennis Nilsen really was began to emerge. In the early 1980s, London's gay scene was thriving. But there were also predators looking to exploit the vulnerable. And Nilsen was one of them.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You're not being a cameraman, you know.
He was recognisable as, a guy on the gay scene, and he was recognisable as gay and kind of old school.
I can't understand you. I ask you to fucking start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must have seen thousands of movies. You must know what it's like.
Nilsen was known to be violent towards young male sex workers, and he was always on the hunt for new victims, people who didn't know his reputation.
Nilsen was known as TTM, the taxi man. He was known to chat up people, the suggestion of money, the suggestion of a taxi, do you want to come home and stay the night with me? It was that kind of thing. The word was out that he was dodgy, that he had a terrible temper, that he was violent. He once said to me, "Lead and they follow so easily."
Tragically, many did. After Stephen Sinclair was identified, the investigation's attention moved to Nilsen's previous home in Melrose Avenue, 5 miles from Cranley Gardens. It was a ground floor flat with a back garden.
Search teams equipped with spades, sieves and rakes arrived to turn over the garden of Nilsen's first home in Melrose Avenue.
Nilsen told the police he kept up to 3 bodies at a time under the floorboards at Melrose Avenue. He'd dissect them on the kitchen floor, then burn the dismembered body parts in his back garden. He drew a map to show where he lit the fires.
When we got there, we went straight out to the garden and it was freezing. And I thought, this is not going to be easy digging here anyway in February. We were looking for bones. I found 2 or 3 the first half an hour, and then it went on to dozens. We probably had 1,000 bones in the ground there. So how many people are there?
The work is going slowly, for it appears that the bones are scattered over the whole area of the garden.
I found a latchkey. I found a torn, charred piece of a postcard with an Australian stamp on it. Has he picked up a backpacker?
How many people do you know of?
Maybe 5 or 6.
Can you say anything about them?
Nothing at all.
Were they male or female?
Male.
And what age?
We believe between 20 and 40.
Nilsen had moved into the ground floor flat with his then boyfriend, 20-year-old David Gallahan, in November 1975.
Go on, mate, let's have a little smile then. Come on, have a little smile. Little smile, come on. Like that. Come on, ducky, little smile.
Nilsen filmed this remarkable home footage of David in the garden.
When we came here, this back garden was like a bloody rubbish heap with tons of old cookers and tyres and debris and plaster and wood and God knows what else.
This was the garden where Nilsen would later burn the remains of some of the men he admitted killing. In May 1977, Nilsen's relationship with David came to a bitter end.
You've been biting my cardigan again.
It was the moment everything seemed to change. A year later, he killed for the first time. Professor David Wilson is an expert on serial killers and has met many of them, including Nilsen.
I first met Dennis Nilsen because I was the new assistant governor under training at HMP Wormwood Scrubs. And of course, I'd read all about this man in the newspapers. There was a sense in which I wondered, have we got our own Hannibal Lecter in Dennis Nilsen? And so I had this incredible expectation about meeting him for the very first time, and I can tell you now, I was completely underwhelmed. Most serial killers that I've met are really silent and uncommunicative. Nilsen was the opposite. Nilsen spoke endlessly about the murders that he had committed. Dennis Nilsen wanted to be in control and dominant and domineering. He wanted to control his legacy. He wanted to tell everybody who Dennis Nilsen was. He was a true narcissist.
It was my power and his passivity. The more passive he could be, the more powerful I was. I still feel in a spiritual communion with these people.
Nilsen was still cooperating with the police, but he was playing mind games. Of the 12 victims he initially confessed to killing at Melrose Avenue, he would offer only vague details as to who some of them were. He only ever gave the detectives 3 full names: Kenneth Ockenden, who went missing in December 1979, Billy Sutherland, who Nilsen strangled in 1980, and finally, Martin Duffy.
The door went and you came in and you said it's the police. And that's when they said about Nilsen, and there was a possibility that Martin was one of the victims.
Nilsen had befriended the 16-year-old the day he arrived in London. Detectives hoped the Duffys could identify items found at his flat.
It wasn't easy telling them the truth about their son. He'd been a victim of a man who at that time was headline news around the world.
Nilsen had taken a left luggage ticket from our Martin after he'd killed him and went back to Euston to pick up the property. Nilsen was using Martin's briefcase to take his sandwich and his newspaper into the office.
That's right,
Nilsen also used Martin's treasured chef's knives. They had been a gift from his father.
Horrifically, he used the knives as well to put the victims
Of course,
up. Martin's knives. That was a shock.
Nilsen's crimes shocked the world. He'd confessed to killing 15 young men, but what turned a Mr. Ordinary into a serial killer? Dennis Nilsen was born just after the Second World War in the port town of Fraserburgh in Scotland. His parents, Betty and Olaf, divorced in 1949, and he became close to his grandfather. He told author Brian Masters that the death of his grandfather when he was just 5 years old had a profound effect on him.
His mother said to him, "Do you want to see your granddad?" "Oh, yes." And he went into the dining room, and there on the dining table was a box. And inside the box was his grandfather. Nobody told him anything. Nobody explained it to him. But I was convinced, and I put this to him, that his idea of love and his idea of death fused at that moment. And thereafter, he always wanted either to be dead himself, and he would pretend to be dead, or eventually he got round to killing people instead.
The making myself look dead was nothing to do with death itself. It was making myself look as different from me as it was possible to imagine, so that I could really be convincing as being somebody else.
In 1985, Brian Masters published his best-selling book, Killing for Company. the result of hours of conversations with Nilsen himself.
He wanted company, and he wanted especially to have company which didn't interrupt. So eventually he fell back on this fantasy of his grandfather and the dead. And he would make somebody dead in order to be able to talk to them. This was the nearest he ever got to friendship. And I think it's tragic from the point of view of the people he encountered, obviously, but it's also pretty grim for him.
It's something I just can't understand this. I've tried and I've thought about it and thought about it. He just must be sick or something, because it's not the Dennis I knew that's doing this, somehow or other.
By the age of 15, he was determined to get away from his family. In June 1961, he enlisted in the British Army Catering Corps and was posted to Aldershot.
Dennis Nilsen was in the same squad as me, V squad. He was weird, I say weird, but for the fact he got a strange sense of humour. He was very argumentative.
It was there, as an apprentice army chef, that Nilsen learned how to butcher meat.
Kitchen work was to get you ready for working in the main kitchens. You learned how to cut up sides of beef, carcasses of lamb, sides of pork, and so forth. He was very meticulous, actually. He was a good chef. I just find it amazing that somebody could actually commit the crimes he did.
After 11 years in the army and only reaching the rank of corporal, Nilsen decided he'd had enough. He moved to London and eventually joined the Met as a trainee police officer. A revelation that initially shocked detectives. They were investigating one of their own.
During the interviews, it came out that he had been a police officer. Now, when I found out that he hadn't made his 2-year probation, I wasn't too concerned, and I thought that if Nilsen said he'd resigned, I would have thought it's more likely that he was gently ushered out the door.
He'd lasted just 12 months, leaving, he claimed, because of homophobia. He joined the civil service as a junior officer at a job centre. Then the murders began. Nilsen was preying on the vulnerable, young men he thought would not be missed, sometimes runaways and sex workers. But one of his victims was different. A mistake that could have ended his killing spree 3 years earlier.
On the 3rd of December 1979, Kenneth Ockenden left his hotel at between 9 and 10 in the morning. It was the last time he was positively seen alive.
Kenneth Ockenden was a 23-year-old tourist from Canada who'd been due to fly home when he met Nilsen in a pub. They went sightseeing around the capital. Then Kenneth disappeared. It became an international incident, with the Canadian Prime Minister calling Margaret Thatcher, piling on political pressure for the inquiry to be ramped up.
Police said there was a strong possibility that Kenneth Ockenden had been murdered. But he did make one last phone call. It was to his uncle in Surrey. The call came from a public call box. There was music in the background.
The police couldn't find him, and the truth only came to light when Nilsen was finally caught 3 years later. He'd taken Kenneth back to his flat in Melrose Avenue, then strangled him. He'd kept his body under the floorboards, bringing it out to wash and dress it, watching television with the corpse as company. Now the investigation team needed proof, and they had a lead discovered in Nilsen's home.
When they found an A to a Z of London, fingerprint people took it back to Scotland Yard, and they blasted every page of this book, and they found a fingerprint, and that fingerprint identified Kenneth Ockenden.
Nilsen was charged with Kenneth Ockenden's murder. and of another man police had now identified. Malcolm Barlow was suffering from a fit when Nilsen found him and helped him get to hospital. When the 24-year-old returned to say thank you, Nilsen invited him into his flat and strangled him. He kept Malcolm's body under his kitchen sink before burning it in the back garden. Five men had complained to police in the past that they'd been the victims of violent attacks by Nilsen, but their cases had never been properly followed up. Now, the murder investigation team needed to track them down.
It was when he was in one of the hostels in London.
One of those survivors was 21-year-old Carl Stotter.
Carl was a lovely man. I idolised him. He had this infectious laugh that he always used to open his mouth, very much like Marilyn Monroe, chucked his head back and he would mouth open and laugh.
Julie has never spoken publicly about what happened to her brother. He left home after coming out as gay and being disowned by his father.
It had a profound effect on him, and I think that the rest of his life all he looked out for was love from another man.
In April 1982, he met Nilsen in the Black Cap pub in Camden Town.
Nilsen brought him a drink when the pub's shut. Dennis Nilsen said, well, do you want to come back to mine for a drink? And he said yes.
Nilsen paid for the 15-minute taxi ride back to his top-floor flat in Cranley Gardens.
Nilsen made him a drink, put some music on. I think he whispered, I'm falling in love with you. He didn't feel very well at all, and I think that's when they went to bed early. And I think Nilsen had drugged his drink.
I sort of felt his hands, like, at first I thought he was sort of like helping me out of it, but he sort of shouted, sort of whispered, sort of keep still, and I sort of passed out.
Nilsen was trying to kill him. The next thing Carl knew, he was in the bath.
The thought that went through my mind was, you are drowning, you are being murdered by this man, and this is what it feels like, and you're going to die. And I thought I was dying.
For some reason, Nilsen stopped. Instead, he began reviving him.
And I saw my face in the mirror, and all my tongue was all swollen, my face was bloated, and I had like red blotches where the blood vessels had burst in my face, and my neck was all sort of like cut round here.
Nilsen helped a confused and disorientated Carl to a nearby tube station. After getting treatment at a hospital, he reported what had happened to the police.
The police put it down to a lover's tiff. Carl could only remember Des's first name, and that he lived in Muswell Hill. So he didn't have enough information to put a formal complaint in, but at the same time the police didn't take it seriously because it was the 1980s and there was a lot of homophobia in the police force and in the country.
Nilsen was questioned 3 times following different complaints, but police took no further action. Nilsen was able to kill 2 more young men after his attack on Carl. London, 1983. Murder detectives are trying to identify the victims of serial killer Dennis Andrew Nilsen. After months of investigations, the police had only identified 5 of 15 men he confessed to killing. Nilsen had given them another name, John from High Wycombe. After painstakingly searching records, detectives confirmed victim number 6 as John Howlett. Nilsen had strangled and drowned him in March 1982. The team at Melrose Avenue had also uncovered more objects, including 3 dental plates. Exhibits officer Brian Lodge thought that they could give them more names.
I took them to some North London dental laboratories and asked if they could say who they were made by or who they were for, etc., etc. But from what I learned, They were all made in Germany. And I suggested to the inquiry that perhaps inquiry should be made in Germany.
But by then, the investigation's overtime bill was rumoured to be over £1 million. Brian's request was denied.
That suggestion was never allowed, never followed up, which I thought was rather a shame, because perhaps there are probably many, many families around the country now who are wondering still, was their son, was their brother, their uncle, their dad a victim of this man? Something we'll never know, something they'll never know.
Nilsen's 14th victim, and the last to be identified at Cranley Gardens, was Graham Allen from Glasgow. He was 28 and had a child. Police had found a jawbone and matched it to Graham's dental records. But because it happened only days before Nilsen's trial, the murder was never added to the indictment.
The Nilsen murder trial at the Old Bailey has entered its closing stages. Dennis Nilsen is charged with 6 murders and 2 attempted murders.
Nilsen entered a not guilty plea on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The court heard evidence from 3 psychologists about his mental state, and the prosecution argued he was in his right mind when he killed. The jury agreed.
At the Old Bailey, Dennis Nilsen has been found guilty of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. He's been jailed for life with a recommendation that he should serve a minimum of 25 years.
Author Brian Masters was at the court every day. He believes the jury came to the right verdict.
He was an intelligent man. He knew perfectly well that it was wrong to kill people, but he didn't know why it mattered so much. The last victim, he'd cut the head off before he went to bed and put it in a cooking pot and put it on to simmer, and they went to bed. When he woke up in the morning to take the dog out for a walk, the pot was still simmering. When he came back, adjusted the flame to see whether it needed to be turned up or put down again. Then he buttered a slice of toast and ate it. I couldn't do that. It is not possible unless you are severely damaged in your moral sense.
Hello, who are you?
Oh, well, we're pissed off at the moment.
Why's that?
Well, I mean, for starters, with effect from the 22nd of August, nobody can smoke in the visitors' hall at all, on any occasion.
In the early 1990s, Peter Paul Hartnett began researching a book and exchanging letters with him. He also recorded some of their conversations. It's the first time these have been heard.
We've got one of these puritanical bastards in charge of the prison now. Going to get himself a bloody grade 1 riot by Christmas, one way or another.
Yeah.
There will be much blood.
Over the years, I was getting many letters a week. It might be 3 one week, 5 the next. And believe me, they were a bore of a chore to wake up to, because it was page after page.
Nilsen asked him to edit his autobiography. What he had written was shocking.
He was saying in the manuscript he had a regret about the murders. And the regret was that he hadn't kept body parts in glasses of formaldehyde, genitals, a pretty hand. If Nilsen had the money, one of his fantasies was to have a van in which he could pick up hitchhikers, get them in the back of the van, gas them, and bring them home.
Hartnett declined to work on the book, and by 2002, they stopped corresponding.
There were too many triggers. There were things that I had to say, I think we need to edit that out. And one person you couldn't edit was Nilsen. Control freak.
In death situations where a knife is involved, there's a lot of blood flying around. I'd love to stab you right now, you have to stab me. The heart is pumping away there, there'll be blood splashing all over the place. Yes. Funny enough, in a dead body, there's no blood spurts or anything like that. It congeals inside and forms part of the flesh in there, and it becomes like anything in a butcher's shop. There's little or no blood.
During his time as a prison governor, David Wilson interviewed Nilsen a number of times and studied his motivations.
The reason why Dennis Nilsen killed was because this was an extension of his sexual fantasy. He killed, therefore, because it was through those murders and then what he could do with the victims after they had died. Does fantasy shape the reality, or does fantasy shape the reality until the first murder, and then does fantasy propel the sequence of murders in an ever more dramatic way? Because once you've engaged in the reality the first time, it's no longer fantastic.
The most exciting part of the little conundrum was when I lifted the body, carried it. It was an expression of my power to lift and carry and have control. And the dangling element of limp limbs was an expression of his passivity.
Over the course of time, not only is he killing his victims, he is then washing his victims. He's propping his victims up in chairs or on bed. And although he would deny it, and did deny it to me, there is evidence to suggest that he would engage in necrophilia. He would have sex with their dead bodies. I think there is some indication about cannibalism, despite, again, the fact that he would deny it. He would trophy take. He would cut up and keep some of the victims' body parts whilst disposing of other parts. This is somebody who was a complete and utter failure in his life, and the only way that he could gain some sense of who he wanted to be was through killing and after he had murdered. And that's the ultimate form of being a loser.
Carl died the day that he found out that Dennis Nilsen tried to kill him. He had survivor's guilt. He couldn't understand why he was saved and the others weren't. And he just needed the pain to go away, which made him an alcoholic.
Carl's daughter passed away in 2013. He died alone at the age of 52. What happened in 1982 haunted him until the end.
His life was horrendous for him. He lived in his own hell and his own prison.
But Nilsen's attempt to kill her brother also devastated her own family. 3 years ago, Julie's oldest son, Jack, took his own life. He suffered from depression and said that he didn't want to end up like his uncle Carl.
His personality, the nice side of him, was like my brother. Jack had hit a depressed spot, and he'd remembered what Nanny had gone through with Carl, and didn't want to put me through the same thing. Dennis Nilsen destroyed my family, both my son and my brother. Sorry.
Only 8 of Nilsen's victims were ever identified. The rest remain unknown to this day.
Events like this can blow families apart, but for us it definitely pulled us closer together.
Yeah.
There's yards and yards of column inches given over to Nilsen and his motivations, but very little about the people that he killed. And those people were far more important than Nilsen will ever be.
The victims are all like just an afterthought, I suppose. And because of the way Martin certainly, and most of the others were portrayed in the press, it's very unjust.
Describing all of his victims as gay, homeless drifters was purely just a catch-all term to sort of pigeonhole people into being of less value. Nothing could be further from the truth. Martin was part of our family. He was loved.
And we miss him.